Nothing grows under the shade of the banyan tree, the saying goes. Ferdinand Marcos ruled so long that the national amnesia set in. Today, the Filipino who can remember life before Marcos is a rarity. Rarer still are those who can recall life before Marcos and who have bothered to share those recollections with generations to come. Tonight, you will meet a lady who was not only a senator, political prisoner, and maverick, but who has also written down her memories. Tonight, Eva Estrada Calao, Grand Dame of the Nacionalista Party, explains her life and times. I'm Manolo, Quezon, the Explainer. This is the Explainer, where we explain why issues are issues. Now, our explainee tonight is someone familiar to you, Jackie Pascual, a writer for ANC. Welcome to the show, Jackie.
Thank you, Manolo.
Well, you know, we're going to be meeting someone who's had a tremendous experience in public service and in politics. But as we prepare to do that, why don't you invite our audience to weigh in with their questions for Eva Estrada Calao?
Sure, Manolo. To all our viewers, join our discussion. Text REACT space X space your name, your question or reaction, and send to 2366 for Globe and 231 for Smart. Or you can also log on to www.the-explainer.com.
You can also log on to plurk.com and look for our account, MLQ3, and you can post your questions there. So more on Eva Estrada Calao when we return. Eva Estrada Calao belongs to that generation of Filipinas who fulfilled Rizal's dream of obtaining an education and participating fully in our national life. A graduate of the pre-war University of the Philippines, she belongs too to the generation that found its young adulthood engulfed by the horrors of the Second World War. And yet it was during the years of the Japanese occupation that Eva Estrada became Eva Estrada Calao, marrying Teodoro Calao Jr., a veteran of the Death March on June 11, 1944. Now, for 9 years, she lived the life of a housewife until the election of 1953, when she plunged into politics. The main contenders that year were incumbent Elpidio Quirino and his former Secretary of National Defense, Ramon Magsaysay. But Eva Estrada Calao entered politics by campaigning for Claro M. Recto, setting the stage for her own political odyssey. Like Don Claro, she too would come to be known as stubborn and quixotic, and it was Recto who advised her to serve her country if the opportunity arose, but, as she recounts in her book, he also offered her some pragmatic advice. First, he said, just make sure you have your own poll inspectors. Now, during the Garcia presidency with its Filipino First policy, Calao headed the NEPA, or National Economic Protectionism Association, and helped organize a grassroots women's movement, the Samahang Pilipina. Now, Macapagal defeated Garcia in 1961, and throughout the Macapagal years, Calao, being a nationalista, was in opposition to the ruling liberals. Now, in 1965, Diosdado Macapagal broke his promise to the Liberal Senate President, and as a result, a frustrated Ferdinand Marcos, who was that Senate President, ended up doing to Macapagal as Rojas had done to Osmeña and as Magsaysay had done to Quirino. He left the party he'd belonged to and joined the other side. But even though a promising bet, Marcos wasn't the only bet. And in a fascinating portion of her book, Calao recounts how Marcos clinched the Nacionalista Party nomination, where his main opponent was former Vice President Emmanuel Pelaez. According to Calao, the NP party convention took place in the Manila Hotel, and beneath Pelaez's suite, Marcos hired a room and filled it with bugging equipment. So not only did Marcos know Pelaez's every move, but Pelaez made it worse for himself by refusing to bribe the Nacionalista Party delegates. Then, when the party voting began, Marcos's supporters grabbed all 4 microphones on the floor so no one could speak up in support of the other candidates. Now, the Nacionalista Party came up with the slogan, Alis Dyan, and senatorial candidate Calao barnstormed the country and was part of the NP landslide in 1965. But relations between Marcos and Senator Eva Estrada Calao were at best uneasy. In the Senate, she viewed herself as a senator for all Filipinos and not just a token representative of womankind. And she also found herself caught in the intrigues that inevitably occupy the time of senators as they plot who to make Senate president and engage in counterplots to replace him. Her book describes as well the way senators crossed partisan lines in deliberating on national issues. Armed with a national constituency, it was difficult to think purely in terms of one's party affiliation, not least when one's party chief had it in for you politically. Now, as the country prepared for the crucial midterm elections of 1971, Ninoy Aquino, a liberal, approached nationalista Eva Estrada Calao, who'd heard Marcos intended to drop her from the party's senatorial slate. Aquino helped convince Calao to become a liberal. And so, after 2 decades as a nationalista, in 1971 began the next decade and a half of Calao's incarnation as a liberal. It was a near-fatal decision, for Eva Estrada Calao was one of those on stage at Plaza Miranda when it was bombed. She wasn't the most wounded, but she was among the victorious in an opposition Senate sweep the country hadn't seen since Quirino's ruling party was rooted at the polls in the 1951 senatorial elections. And it was Calao who faced up to party elders like Diosdado Macapagal, who wanted to simply shut up and sit it out when martial law was imposed by Marcos in September 1972. Indeed, with many of its leaders like Aquino and Salonga in exile abroad, when the man you see here, Senator Gerardo Rojas, died in 1982, it seemed to Calao that as the senior liberal still at home, the mantle of the party leadership had now fallen on her. But wily old Marcos had a trick up his sleeve, and it was the snap election. The fragmented opposition rushed to form a coalition, and Calao, though instrumental in getting the remnants of the old NP and LP to unite and form Unido, found herself shoved aside. This meant that the Aquino Laurel and Marcos Tolentino tandems had a third candidate for vice president slugging it out, Eva Estrada Calao. And so even as the country celebrated EDSA, Calao found herself, ironically, once more in the opposition. In the end, her disillusionment with EDSA would reconcile her with Doy Laurel and lead the two to try and revive the Nacionalista Party, whose standard bearers they became in 1992. So when we return, Eva Estrada Calao, her memories, and her opinions.
As President of the Philippines,
preserve and defend its fundamental law,
preserve and defend its fundamental law,
execute its just laws,
execute its just law,
do justice to every man,
do justice to every man,
and consecrate myself
to
the service of the nation.
To the service of the nation.
So help me God.
So help me God.
When Cory Aquino took her oath of office, then Member of Parliament Eva Estrada Calao had misgivings about the way things had turned out. She became an oppositionist, a maverick, rounding up her period of public service, ironically within government, later on as our de facto ambassador to Taiwan under Presidents Ramos and Estrada. Today, as the party chief of her beloved Nacionalista Party prepares to run for the presidency, it seems to me interesting to view not only his run, but the institution he now heads, and to which Calao belonged, from Eva Estrada Calao's point of view. So the Nacionalista Manuel, who now heads the Senate, knows as well as the first Nacionalista Manuel who headed that chamber, that the Senate President always faces the risk of a mutiny from his own coalition. Calao herself, in the intramurals between Arturo